Hibiki was an unremarkable young man, auraless, directionless, and utterly ordinary in every sense of the word. He was a regular high school student in Japan, living a perfectly average life, until one fateful morning when everything changed. Having overslept on the last day of school before the holidays, he rushed to class as fast as his legs could carry him. The moment he threw open his classroom door, however, he was not greeted by the familiar faces of his classmates. Instead, he found himself transported to a vast, open grassland in a completely different world, surrounded on all sides by dangerous monsters. He barely had time to process what had happened before a horned rabbit with glowing red eyes began charging at him. Panicking, with no idea where he was or why a rabbit with horns was pursuing him, Hibiki ran with everything he had. In his frantic flight, he somehow managed to pull up a floating stats screen for the creature, which clearly indicated it was a level 1 monster. The rabbit leapt into the air to attack, but Hibiki slipped at exactly the right moment and rolled out of the way. Its horns tore through his bag instead and became lodged there. Off balance, Hibiki tumbled on top of the beast, inadvertently crushing it. He was deeply shaken by the whole ordeal. He immediately reached for his phone to call for help, only to find there was no signal. Trying to keep his composure, he became acutely aware of his growling stomach. He had not eaten since morning. He looked at the dead rabbit and wondered whether it was even edible, and whether he had any way to cook it without fire. At that moment, the stats screen reappeared for the creature, informing him that it was indeed edible and commonly prepared as a stew in many parts of the region. Even so, he could not bring himself to butcher it, so he packed it into his torn bag and started walking. As he moved, he began testing the limits of his newfound ability. He checked the stats of his backpack, only to find that because the bag was not of this world, its materials were listed as unknown and could not be appraised. Curious, he pointed the ability at the sky, but received a message that there was no valid target. When he turned it toward the ground, however, the screen returned a chilling result. A level 273 monster known as a maze eater was directly below him. Baffled, he ran the appraisal several more times and received the same response each time. Concluding that something enormous might be hiding underground, he decided not to linger. He also attempted to activate a skill called Expert Eye, imagining he would look impressive doing so, but nothing happened. Deciding he needed to find civilization quickly, he pulled up a map he somehow had access to, which displayed the terrain in unfamiliar detail. Spotting a small glowing dot nearby, he followed it. By evening, he arrived at a cobblestone road, which filled him with relief, until he tumbled excitedly down the embankment and landed face first on the cold stone. He looked up to find a monstrous dog staring down at him. Both of them startled each other, and in the resulting commotion, an arrow came flying from the tree line and struck the dog cleanly in the head, dropping it instantly. Hibiki turned to find a young woman watching him, a real person, not another monster. He thanked her profusely, and she brushed it off casually, introducing herself simply as Emilia. Hibiki noticed her long, pointed ears and wondered aloud if she was cosplaying as an elf. Emilia had no idea what cosplay was. She then asked, with evident disbelief, whether Hibiki had actually wandered in from the Maze Eater's grassland and survived. Before he could answer properly, Hibiki quietly used his appraisal skill on her and discovered that she was, in fact, a real elf, 56 years old despite her youthful appearance. Emilia explained that the Maze Eater was a creature that disguised itself as the grassland itself, waiting patiently for prey to collapse from exhaustion before consuming them. She pulled him into a brief hug and told him he had done remarkably well simply by making it through the day alive. As night fell, she produced a pot and cooked the rabbit into a hearty stew, thanking Hibiki for contributing it, since otherwise they might have gone hungry. Hibiki asked where they were and whether she had heard of a place called Japan. Emilia said she had not, but promised to escort him to the nearest city. In the middle of the night, Hibiki woke from a dream and noticed small green orbs of light floating in the air around their camp. He used his ability on them and discovered they were a protective alarm spell that Emilia had cast, designed to alert them if anyone came too close. Standing in the night air, Hibiki finally came to terms with the fact that this was not a dream. He was in another world entirely, and anything could happen to him there. He began to piece together the nature of his ability, that of an appraiser, a job class that existed in this world, though not an especially rare one. He thought, with some bitterness, that even in a fantasy world he had ended up being perfectly average, then pushed the thought aside and went back to sleep, turning over ideas about how to eventually return home. The following morning, the two set off toward the nearest city. While moving through the forest, Hibiki casually mentioned that there were monsters all around them. Emilia was impressed, asking how he could sense that. Hibiki corrected her, he could not sense anything. He simply knew because of his world map skill, which displayed the locations of nearby creatures. Emilia stopped in her tracks, completely stunned. She told him that the world map was an elite rank skill, meaning it was extraordinarily rare. Hibiki remained unimpressed, pointing out that it only showed him where he had walked and where monsters were. Emilia stared at him as though he had said something deeply foolish, explaining that any adventurer would give almost anything for that kind of information. She went on to describe the Adventurers Guild and the system of quests it managed, which helped Hibiki understand at least the basics of how this world functioned. Emilia realized, in retrospect, that the world map was precisely the reason Hibiki had survived the Maze Eater's grassland without even knowing what it was. Moments later, Hibiki glanced at his map and casually mentioned there was a crystal horn rabbit nearby, assuming it was simply another variety of the horned rabbit he had already encountered. Emilia's reaction was anything but casual. She seized his arm and sprinted in the direction he pointed, explaining breathlessly that the crystal horn rabbit was exceptionally rare, and that its horn could be used to cure virtually any poison. On a good day, it could fetch up to 200 gold coins. They located the creature foraging in a clearing. Hibiki appraised it and reported that it possessed two skills, escape and presence detection, meaning it would be nearly impossible to approach undetected. Emilia told him not to worry, as she possessed skills of her own, including odor cut and sound cut, which masked her presence entirely. She added that, compared to his world map ability, which could locate targets that most trackers could never find, her own skills were relatively modest. She remarked that any party would want him, even in a non-combat role, because a good party was built on the combined strengths of its members. Emilia drew her bow, channeled the wind into a spirit arrow, and fired at full power. The arrow moved with extraordinary speed. Yet the rabbit detected it at the last possible moment and vanished from the clearing in a single blink. Emilia sighed, conceding that her strongest attack had not even come close. Hibiki proposed a different approach. If he drew the creature's attention, it would focus on him and might not anticipate the arrow. Emilia thought it was worth trying. She lured the rabbit out with a strip of ivy, then conjured a wall to cut off its escape. Faced with the barrier, the creature turned and spotted Hibiki, whose aura was so faint it apparently seemed like easy prey. The rabbit charged straight at him, and Emilia stepped out of the bushes and put it down with a clean headshot. A notification appeared in Hibiki's vision, informing him that he had leveled up. Emilia retrieved the crystal horn, declared that they made an excellent team, and suggested they might consider working together permanently. Later that day, they arrived at the city of R, a lively, densely populated town filled with travelers of all kinds. Emilia noticed immediately that Hibiki's clothing looked conspicuously out of place and draped her cloak over him, noting it was a little long on account of his modest height, but would serve for the time being. Once they sold the horn, she said, they would have enough to buy him proper clothes and possibly some weapons and armor. Hibiki asked what 200 gold coins was actually worth in practical terms. Emilia stared at him in disbelief that someone could be entirely unaware of local currency. Hibiki quietly cross-referenced his abilities and determined that 200 gold was roughly equivalent to 10,000 in his world's money. Before he could dwell on that figure, Emilia gently touched his face and told him, with more care than reproach, that however new he was to this world, he should be careful not to let his ignorance show too openly, as people would not hesitate to take advantage of him. They entered the Adventurers Guild shortly afterward. Emilia was clearly well known there, and several people called out to ask whether she had finally decided to form a party. When they caught sight of Hibiki, laughter broke out, with someone asking whether she had taken up babysitting. Emilia snapped back that despite appearances, Hibiki was a fully grown adult who simply happened to be vertically challenged. A member of a notable party called the Silver Banner intervened, telling the others to show some respect, before patting Hibiki on the shoulder and telling him not to take their words to heart. At the reception desk, they were greeted by a beast woman named Jewel, who knew Emilia as well and asked what she wanted. Emilia requested a private room to handle a sale. They were taken upstairs, where they met the guild master, an enormous, spectacularly muscled man named Bal. Hibiki was immediately and vocally in awe of his physique, which delighted Bal enormously. He pulled off his shirt to give Hibiki a better view, and the two fell into an enthusiastic discussion about training regimens while Emilia and Jewel looked on in barely concealed disgust, eventually using their magic to drop both men to the floor and bring the conversation to a reluctant close. Once everyone was seated, Emilia presented the crystal horn. Bal's eyes lit up, declaring it was the largest he had seen in 3 years, and offered 400 gold coins. Emilia rejected the offer without hesitation. She pointed out that the horn from 3 years ago had sold for 230 gold coins, and that hers was 3 times as large, meaning she expected 3 times the original price, 780 gold. The negotiation that followed was lengthy and heated, but Emilia held her ground. After considerable back and forth, Bal eventually agreed to 700 gold coins through clenched teeth. Jewel smiled pleasantly and informed Bal that since they had gone so far over budget, the overage would simply be deducted from his salary the following month. Emilia emerged from the meeting elated, already imagining that Hibiki would ask her to take him on as a permanent party member. Hibiki, however, said nothing of the sort and slipped away while she sorted out the financial details with Jewel, finding a seat downstairs at one of the guild tables. There, sitting quietly, he became aware of a voice in his head, not the sound of his own thoughts, but something else entirely. At first he wondered if he was losing his mind, but the presence clarified itself. It was the god of this world, explaining that he had granted Hibiki certain abilities, including a tutorial skill, to help him acclimate gradually without being overwhelmed. The god acknowledged that he could not maintain contact consistently and that their conversations would be infrequent, but promised to assist Hibiki as best he could. With that, the voice faded, leaving Hibiki with considerably more questions than answers. He was still trying to make sense of the encounter when Emilia returned, but her expression had changed entirely. A guild member had handed her an envelope containing a designated quest, a specially assigned mission she could not refuse. She told Hibiki that the job was highly dangerous and that she could not bring him along. Hibiki told her not to worry and insisted he would be fine on his own, though he was privately far less certain of that than he let on. Emilia had already spoken to Jewel and arranged for her to keep an informal eye on him. She pressed a map into his hands showing the location of the house where she kept a room in the city, and told him to speak to a woman named Tanya at the Goddess Inn, where he could sleep until she returned. On her way out of the city, Emilia rounded a corner too quickly and collided with a dark-haired girl, sending her stumbling. She apologized quickly, explaining that she had received unexpected news and was leaving in a hurry. The girl replied that it was a strange coincidence, as she herself was heading toward the elf country, and asked if they might travel together. Emilia agreed and the two departed. Back in the city, Hibiki spent the evening doing very little, lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling Emilia's absence more acutely than he had expected. Even the god was not answering when he tried to reach out. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts. Tanya, the innkeeper, appeared and gently told him that dinner was being served and he had not eaten all day, calling him down in a tone that brooked no argument. As he sat up, Hibiki began to think practically. He needed income, and he needed to find it without combat, since his stats made it absolutely clear that fighting was not an option. He noticed he possessed a skill that allowed him to absorb the contents of medical books simply by passing through their pages. He activated it, and a medical textbook materialized in front of him, then proceeded to download its entire contents directly into his mind over the course of 2 days. When it was finally over, he felt as though his brain had been thoroughly violated by a library. He got up, went shopping at the nearest armory, and acquired basic gear that would help him blend in with the population. Then he made his way to the guild to look for work. Before he could even reach the front desk, however, the doors flew open and the Silver Banner party stumbled in, battered and hollow-eyed. The silver-haired man who had spoken kindly to Hibiki earlier, he would later learn his name was Jade, collapsed to the floor, missing an arm entirely. Jewel rushed over in alarm, asking whether they had tried healing magic. The party replied that it had not worked. Hibiki stepped forward and asked to examine him. A woman in the party told him sharply that they needed a healer, not an appraiser. Hibiki replied quietly that he had read some relevant texts and believed he could help. He quickly determined that beyond the physical injury, Jade had also been poisoned, and that the spell required to cleanse that poison demanded more magical energy than Hibiki could generate on his own. He asked the room if anyone could temporarily transfer their mana to him. Jewel and several members of Jade's party agreed at once. Drawing on the pooled mana, Hibiki channeled an advanced healing spell that expelled the poison from Jade's body, then cast a second spell that restored his missing arm. The effort immediately knocked Hibiki unconscious. He woke in a guild room with Jewel sitting nearby. She thanked him with visible emotion, explaining that Jade was her brother, and that she had been genuinely terrified for him. She then warned Hibiki that the spells he had used were entirely unknown in the city, and that if the knowledge spread, people would try to exploit him. She advised him to hire a bodyguard, ideally one who was part beast, part human, and physically capable of handling threats. Following her recommendation, Hibiki visited a business called the Debbie Company in search of someone suitable. The establishment looked far more like a noble's estate than anything related to security services. He was received by its proprietor, a peculiar man named Adrath Debbie, who immediately abandoned formalities and began sniffing around Hibiki with intense interest. He explained that he possessed a skill called Sense for Money, a literal ability to smell the scent of future wealth emanating from a client. He had identified Hibiki immediately as an exceptionally valuable one. Debbie showed him a series of imposing fighters, but Hibiki turned them all down. Strength alone was not his priority. He needed someone with high mana reserves, given that he intended to continue relying on healing magic. Debbie, wholly unbothered by the difficulty of the request, offered to show him a separate section of the property. As they moved through the manor, Hibiki sensed a different quality to the air in one particular corridor. Debbie explained that this wing housed those deemed unfit for standard service, individuals who could not return to their homelands or who had been classified as flawed in some way. Hibiki entered and found a cage containing a large wolfman with both arms and a leg missing, and a small girl who looked terrified. According to Debbie, the wolfman had gone on a rampage in defense of the girl, resulting in both of them being confined. The girl possessed magical abilities, he noted, though she had no control over them, which had led to dangerous incidents. Hearing himself and the girl discussed as though they were inventory, the wolfman growled and told the child to look away. Hibiki composed himself and attempted to appraise them, but hit an immediate obstacle. Both the wolfman and the girl appeared to have false or masked stats, presumably a form of protection. It was then that something unexpected occurred. His expert eye skill activated on its own, bypassing the false data entirely. He had never successfully used that ability before. It turned out to be S ranked, a divine gift bestowed by a god at random. Hibiki was beginning to feel increasingly uneasy about how much of his existence in this world amounted to a collection of divine privileges. The expert eye revealed that the wolfman's name was Claude Abras, aged 26, a level 15 knight and, more staggeringly, a level 95 hero. Hibiki nearly lost composure entirely at that second figure. He had never encountered a level so high. The small girl's name, in turn, was Lillian Rouge, and her classification was Sage. She possessed a skill called Raging Sanctuary, described as a trial placed upon her by a god, one that could not be consciously controlled and would eventually lead to self-destruction. Hibiki looked upward briefly, then made his decision. Both Claude and Lillian would serve as his bodyguards, their immense mana reserves alone making them invaluable. He confirmed the purchase with Debbie, who nearly vibrated with excitement, and quickly left the building with his new companions. On the outskirts of town, Hibiki sat down with Claude and Lillian and spoke to them plainly. He told Claude he intended to help him, specifically by using healing magic to restore his missing limbs, and that he needed Lillian's mana to do it. Lillian agreed immediately, eager to repay the wolfman who had protected her through everything. Hibiki established a mana transfer contract with her, and with the pooled energy flowing into him, he activated the perfect heal ability. Light flooded out and Claude howled as his body was rebuilt. Within seconds, he stood whole. Lillian stared at him in stunned, joyful silence. Claude, for his part, allowed the guardedness to slowly drain from his expression. He told Hibiki that while it would take time to rebuild his full strength, the curse still placed a ceiling on what he could do. He could already feel the difference. Claude was shaken to learn that Hibiki knew about the curse, which was meant to be a secret. He was even more unsettled to hear that Hibiki knew Lillian would one day become a powerful sage. When Hibiki explained that the expert eye ability had been given to him directly by a god, Claude went very still. That ability was divine in nature, he said, not something a mortal could simply acquire. Hibiki was then moved to activate the relief measure skill at level 1. A series of spectral chains appeared around Claude's body, tightly wound. A giant pair of shears materialized in the air above him, causing both Hibiki and Lillian to stumble back in alarm, but the shears moved forward and snapped only a single chain before disappearing. Hibiki was somewhat deflated. He had hoped the skill might clear all the chains at once, but at level 1, it could only do so much. Still, Claude dropped to one knee, visibly moved, and apologized for his earlier hostility. He then proposed the ceremony of allegiance, a binding ritual that would create an unbreakable bond between himself and his chosen master. He pledged his body, mind, and soul, and Hibiki placed a golden sword upon his shoulder to formally accept. As the ritual completed, a glowing crest appeared on both of their hands. Claude identified it as the crest of the light spirits, signifying that his loyalty had been acknowledged by higher powers. A system voice suggested that formalizing the arrangement with a contract skill would strengthen the bond further, and Hibiki agreed. Claude wept openly. While Hibiki had been forging unlikely alliances, Emilia, whose full name was Amelia, had been traveling back toward her homeland alongside her oddly devoted maid, Stalia. When Amelia expressed a desire to stop at a nearby hot spring, Stalia was conflicted but had no say in the matter. Their third companion, a girl named Ivel, joined them, and what followed was an increasingly chaotic bathing excursion that Stalia found deeply threatening to her singular attachment to Amelia. Back on the outskirts of the city, Hibiki sat with Claude and Lillian, entering into additional contracts with both of them as their conversation progressed. Claude observed that his new master seemed to be holding a conversation with an invisible third party, and Hibiki admitted that a voice had been guiding and speaking to him since his arrival. This prompted Claude to ask whether Hibiki also possessed the tutorial skill, and whether he carried the title of Wanderer from another world. It emerged that Claude knew something of the lore surrounding people who arrived from other worlds. He had always believed such things were theoretically possible, but had never expected to actually meet one. Claude also offered a clearer picture of this world's spiritual landscape. There were 11 gods in total, he explained, with a chief god who was both extraordinarily powerful and, by all accounts, a complete fool. Hibiki speculated aloud that Lillian's curse might be the chief god's doing. Lillian, who had been listening quietly, reacted with visible distress upon learning that her magical powers could one day destroy her. Hibiki immediately regretted saying it aloud, though Claude gently suggested that Lillian's particular curse was more likely the work of the god of magic rather than the chief god. Shortly afterward, the god of magic made her presence known, arriving, apparently, to settle a score with the chief god. She was far colder and more imperious than the voice Hibiki was accustomed to, and she informed him that she had granted him the grimoire ability specifically so he could help Lillian in the future. She made clear she was not the sort of god who welcomed daily prayers, then departed, taking the sounds of divine retribution with her and leaving Hibiki with a ringing head. When he activated the grimoire skill, a small, fluffy white cat appeared before him. The creature introduced herself as Vene and explained that she had been sent by the god of magic to serve as the grimoire itself and assist him in his travels. Both Hibiki and Lillian were immediately overwhelmed by Vene's appearance and fell over each other to pet her. Claude watched from behind, his mood visibly deteriorating by the second, until Lillian noticed and moved to soothe him. The group went shopping next, outfitting Claude with impressive armor and a spear, and Lillian with new clothes that suited her well. The shopkeeper, in high spirits, informed them that the total for Claude's equipment came to 25 gold coins. Hibiki and Lillian were horrified. Claude considered it extremely cheap. Lillian tried to return her cloak out of guilt, but Hibiki refused to hear of it and insisted she also choose a staff so she could begin practicing magic. Vene then made a point of demanding a decorative collar for herself, which cost an additional 15 gold coins. Hibiki paid with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Vene announced that magical training would begin immediately. While Claude was perfectly capable in combat, both Lillian and Hibiki had fundamental gaps to address. When Hibiki dared to hope that the grimoire skill might allow him to learn powerful magic, Vene flatly informed him that he was only capable of learning basic, largely useless spells. He accepted this with the quiet resignation of someone who had come to expect nothing else. The first lesson focused on helping Lillian control her mana output. Vene explained that she needed to formally bite Hibiki in order to establish the necessary connection, which she did, without ceremony or warning. She then informed Lillian that her magical output had been reduced to 10% of its normal level and would gradually increase as her control improved. Hibiki's own training required him to practice magic power circulation, a technique in which two individuals exchange magical energy to develop a sense of harmony and control. Claude was instructed to circulate his mana through Hibiki. They clasped hands and the energy began to flow. One moment, Hibiki was standing in a sunlit field with his companions. The next, he was somewhere else entirely, a dark expanse filled with stars, where he found himself watching a memory that was not his own. He saw Claude sitting beside a lake with a beautiful elf named Anastasia. The two of them had traveled together for a long time, trusting each other completely. Then the memory shifted to something far darker, a blood-red moon, Claude lying mortally wounded on the ground, and Anastasia standing over him, blood on her hands, clearly responsible for what had been done to him. Hibiki snapped back into his own body to find Claude leaning over him with concern. The wolfman apologized for allowing too much mana to flow into someone with Hibiki's limited capacity, explaining that he had inadvertently wandered too deep into his memories. Vene scolded Claude for the lapse, then asked hopefully whether Hibiki had witnessed anything embarrassing that she might find useful later. He had not, only a beautiful and deeply confusing memory that he did not yet know how to interpret. Training continued the following day, this time with Hibiki taking up household magic, a form of spell casting that involved channeling magical energy through ordinary chores. Elemental spirits would gather the emitted energy as a kind of payment, and once satisfied, they would instruct the user in control techniques. It was not the dramatic training Hibiki had envisioned, but Sapo confirmed there was no shortcut around it. Claude and Lillian arrived that evening, hoping to share dinner with Hibiki. Claude promptly knocked over a bucket of water, creating another mess, then dropped to his knees and begged forgiveness with such earnestness that Hibiki told him the small slip was actually endearing. Claude appeared to experience a mild existential crisis at being described as cute by his master and spent some time staring into the middle distance while Hibiki mopped the floor. Despite his industrious cleaning, Hibiki had still not made enough progress to satisfy the elemental spirits. He did, however, impress the innkeeper Tanya, who was so astonished by the state of the inn that she offered him an extra dish at dinner. Everyone sat down to eat, after which Claude knocked over another bucket of water and quietly began to question his own competence as a person. The next morning, Vene resumed Lillian's lessons and she was improving quickly. Hibiki, by contrast, was struggling with an entirely different problem. He had no idea how to fight. Claude's solution was to hand him a bow. This turned out to be an unhappy experiment. Hibiki's form was poor, his aim was essentially non-existent, and he could not hold the bow correctly even after repeated instruction. When he tried to take a break because his hands were raw from the bowstring, Claude told him firmly to use his healing ability on himself and then get back to work. Somewhere out in the wilderness, Amelia was walking with Stalia and Ivel when the path split. One fork offered a shortcut that passed by an abandoned fortress known to be haunted by mischievous spirits. Amelia was firmly against taking it. Ivel was immediately in favor. When Ivel mentioned the possibility of hidden treasure inside, Amelia, whose funds were running low, reversed her position entirely, and the three of them headed for the fortress. Inside, the spirits did their work. Amelia stumbled into what appeared to be a room overflowing with gold and jewels and erupted in pure joy. Stalia was likewise distracted, though her attention was directed at Amelia in ways that made her lack of objectivity entirely self-evident. Ivel found the two of them lost in an illusion and used her mirror to dispel the spirits. There was no treasure. Back in the field, Hibiki had learned to butcher game, which left everyone thoroughly filthy. He used his newly acquired bubble wash ability on Claude, who stood stoically as the soap worked through his fur. When Claude wiped away the last of the bubbles, his coat gleamed with an almost supernatural smoothness. He looked quietly revitalized. With practical training now taking shape, the question of money reasserted itself. Hibiki tallied his remaining funds after equipping his party and concluded, with some discomfort, that they were approaching broke. He told Claude and Lillian plainly, the only solution was to take on paid work through the guild. Since none of them had yet registered officially, they would have to start at F rank, the lowest rung of quests, unpopular with almost everyone. They registered as a party, and Claude immediately accepted nearly every available quest, reasoning that at low levels they would need quantity over quality to generate meaningful income. Hibiki looked at the crowded quest board and felt a wave of exhaustion before he had even begun. He noticed a wanted poster for a bandit who had been stealing from wealthy citizens, then set it aside as being outside his current capabilities, and headed for the forest to complete his first assignment. Standing before a crystal horn rabbit, Hibiki raised his bow. It took him an embarrassingly long time to land a clean shot, but he did eventually manage it. Claude, watching from nearby, acknowledged that for a complete beginner, it was acceptable. Meanwhile, Lillian moved through the forest collecting herbs for her own set of quests, discovering in the process a particular fruit whose vivid pigment could serve as a trail marker if the party ever got lost. She demonstrated it proudly, and both Claude and Hibiki stared in genuine admiration. At the end of a tiring day, Hibiki had a quiet moment to himself and thought, for the first time in a while, about home, about whether his friends were beginning their summer break, what they might be doing, whether anyone had noticed he was gone. He decided somewhere in that silence that he needed to start finding a way back. He mentioned it to Claude and Lillian that evening, explaining that he eventually hoped to seek out a grand sage, one of the ancient, long-lived sages said to hold centuries of accumulated wisdom. Claude guessed immediately what he was building toward. When Hibiki confirmed it, both Claude and Lillian went quiet. They had not let themselves consider, until that moment, that Hibiki's time with them had an intended end. Claude steadied himself and repeated his promise he would keep Hibiki safe for as long as he remained. The guild had paid out a respectable sum from the day's quests and herb sales. The receptionist had actually grown suspicious of the sheer volume of herbs Lillian had collected and asked whether they had simply purchased them from somewhere. The following day, Hibiki went to find Jewel, only to encounter Bal returning from a trip to the royal capital. Bal was immediately appalled that Hibiki had not put on a single ounce of muscle and announced his intention to personally take him in hand. Claude inserted himself firmly between the two, informing the guild master that muscle was best developed gradually and with care. Bal mocked this philosophy, removed his coat, and began fighting Claude in the middle of the street. The wolfman was outclassed. Bal was extraordinarily fast and powerful, his body built from something that seemed harder than ordinary flesh. Hibiki, watching them exchange blows with escalating intensity, transformed briefly into a stunned bystander who could not believe that two grown men of their caliber were fighting over who got to train a short teenager. Nearby residents fled. Before things escalated further, Jewel arrived and dispatched both combatants with a well-placed burst of ice magic. In the aftermath, a wealthy woman ran through the area shouting that someone had stolen her purse. Hibiki checked his own bag and found that his recently earned guild payment was also gone. Jewel identified the culprit as a known local bandit, someone who could transform their tail into a snake, used it to pick pockets with a subtle tickling sensation, and exclusively targeted the wealthy. Hibiki devised a plan. He disguised himself as a girl, and the disguise was uncomfortably effective. He felt deeply unhappy about how convincing it turned out to be. He and Lillian visited a nearby cafe, leaving a baked pouch of money on the table while Claude waited nearby in position. The ruse almost worked. A waitress took their order, set down their food, and vanished with the baked money before anyone could react. The pouch had been treated to leave a trail of color, and the three of them followed it through a maze of back alleys, arriving eventually at a stairwell that led down into an underground tavern. The establishment was populated by an assortment of unusual individuals. Hibiki, still in disguise, attracted immediate and unwanted attention from several shirtless men with varying approaches to introducing themselves. Ignoring all of them, he scanned the room and spotted a hooded figure who stood out distinctly. They followed the stranger into a corner, and Hibiki told them to return what they had stolen. The figure, revealed to be a beast girl named Fauna, removed her hood without fear and told them that the threat of an appraiser did not particularly concern her. Hibiki escalated, implying he knew more than he had let on. Fauna conceded the point, but then revealed that Hibiki had walked directly into her actual trap. While they had been arguing, she had used the alley's rigging to drop a series of wooden planks on top of them. Claude shielded Lillian and shoved Hibiki clear, then gave chase. Fauna looked back to find Hibiki hanging upside down in a wire snare he had run directly into, asking to be released with considerable urgency. She regarded him in this state, found him unexpectedly charming, and noticed, given that his wig had fallen off, that he was not a girl at all. She offered a deal. She would return the money if Hibiki agreed to appraise several items in her possession. He agreed. The first was a ring of genuine value. The second was a pearl necklace that turned out to be fake stones. Fauna discarded it without a word. The third was a ceremonial dagger. The fourth, and most significant, was a plain wooden bracelet carved with a design meaningful to beast men. Hibiki sensed immediately that it had no great monetary value, but his appraisal revealed something more important. The bracelet bore a carved message from someone named Diana, addressed to Fauna. Fauna went still when he described it and asked what the message said. Hibiki told her it simply said thank you. She sank back into her chair. She explained that the bracelet had been given to her by her little sister, the only person who had ever left such words for her. She had never learned to read, and so had never known what it said until this moment. Hibiki asked her, gently, whether her sister knew she had become a thief. Fauna told him her sister was dead. There had been a conflict, a loss of everything. She spoke from the knowledge of someone who had already learned the lesson at great cost. If Hibiki had a home to return to, he should fight to get back to it. Otherwise it might be gone before he found his way. Before she left, she added one more thing, that every beastman carried a difficult past, and that Claude was no exception. She encouraged Hibiki to ask the wolfman about his background when the moment felt right. She pressed a brief kiss to his cheek, returned the money, and disappeared. That evening, Hibiki sat at the inn while Tanya worked patiently to remove Fauna's lipstick from his face, and Bal delivered news from the royal capital. A new party had emerged from the kingdom, called the Corpse Killers, and had been dispatched by the king to address a rising undead threat. Hibiki reacted to the news with considerable alarm. Bal expected them to arrive in the city within the coming days. Later, with Lillian and Claude settled around him, Hibiki processed the events of the day, the bandit, the appraisals, the story of Diana and the bracelet. He told them that eventually he wanted to travel and seek out someone with deep, ancient knowledge of this world. Claude recognized immediately that he meant a grand sage. When Hibiki confirmed again that his ultimate goal was to find a way home, the silence that followed was heavier than the first time. Claude placed a hand on his knee and repeated his promise he would keep Hibiki safe for as long as he remained. Neither of them said what both were quietly aware of, that the day Hibiki succeeded in going home was the day they would lose him. Meanwhile, Amelia had arrived at the end of her journey with Stalia and Ivel. In a moment that had been building quietly, she mentioned that days ago a strange voice had come to her and told her to travel east, that something precious had fallen there. Ivel went still as the implication settled over her. The thing she had been searching for was not here at all, it was somewhere else entirely. She said a brief, hollow thank you to Amelia, turned, and walked away without a backward glance. Amelia stood watching her go, too stunned to speak. The following morning, over breakfast, the group discussed their next steps. Claude asked Hibiki to confirm whether he was certain about his plan to seek out all the sages in the country and consult them about getting home. Hibiki replied that he believed it was the only viable path forward. Claude thought it over and told him that if that was the case, they would need to make their way to a city called Terodinas, which was where any meaningful search would have to begin. Hibiki had no idea where that was, but V informed him that the city could be reached by passing through a dungeon, and that the closest one connecting to it was the North Dungeon. Having apparently never played a single game or read a fantasy novel in his life, Hibiki had no idea what a dungeon was. Claude explained that they were locations teeming with monsters at every turn and considered extremely dangerous by even experienced adventurers. Unless they trained considerably, he said, their chances of clearing one would be very slim. Hibiki sat with the weight of that, wondering how they were ever going to manage it. Lillian, meanwhile, was in no mood for the conversation. She pushed back from the breakfast table without a word and retreated to her room. At that moment, the guild master arrived and asked if everything was all right. Hibiki told him that things between himself and Lillian had been a little strained lately. The guild master told him to put it out of his mind for now and immediately hauled him off into the forest to begin a training camp. He announced that Hibiki needed to develop real muscle as quickly as possible if he was going to have any hope of surviving a dungeon. V made clear she would rather be anywhere else. Claude did not particularly want to be there either, but conceded that some physical conditioning would not go amiss if they were serious about dungeon clearing. The guild master declared that muscles were always an asset and that there was no downside to having them. Claude disagreed sharply, stating that he would not allow anyone to turn Hibiki into a mindless, muscle-bound brute. While the two of them argued, Hibiki quietly accepted that he had no choice in the matter and braced himself for what was coming. The training began in earnest. The guild master started with core strength, putting Hibiki through a demanding routine of lifting stones, cracking walnuts with his bare fingers, and hauling heavy loads across the terrain, slowly conditioning his body to sustained physical effort. Lillian watched from a distance and remarked that Hibiki seemed to be genuinely giving it everything he had. V agreed, noting that given his lack of combat skills, the least he could do was commit fully to what he was capable of. Lillian grew quietly sad watching him, wondering whether this was how desperately he wanted to return to his own world. V, sensing it, told her gently that they should let him make his own decisions and simply stay by his side until the very end, whatever that looked like. Tanya arrived around that time as well, mentioning that the inn had been slow that day and she had taken the afternoon off. She sat down beside Lillian and watched Hibiki train in comfortable silence. By evening, Claude had taken over and was working with Hibiki on archery again. The results were no better than before. Hibiki could barely hit the target even from a few paces away, sending arrow after arrow wide of the mark. He eventually managed to connect a couple of times before collapsing from exhaustion, declaring that he had nothing left to give for the day. Claude told him he had done well, but added that next time he should aim for the center. The guild master chimed in that even if they could not see any change yet, Hibiki had almost certainly begun building muscle beneath the surface. Curious, Hibiki checked his own stats, and found that absolutely nothing had changed. The guild master laughed and suggested that they should have focused purely on strength training from the start, as that would have shown more measurable results. Claude argued that skill development mattered far more. Another argument was brewing between them when Jewel appeared and firmly shut it down, inviting everyone to come and enjoy a warm soak in the hot springs. In the springs, Hibiki noticed that Claude looked more at ease than he had in some time and asked him about it. Claude replied simply that it had been a long while since he had been able to relax properly. The comment brought Fauna's words back to Hibiki, her mention of the beastman's homeland and the war that had ravaged it. He asked Claude about it directly, saying he had never told him anything about where he came from. Claude smiled a quiet, sorrowful smile and explained that his homeland had been the capital city of Beastronia, the Beast Kingdom, a place that had been completely destroyed, taking with it every companion and friend he had ever known. He said it did not matter much now, as it had all happened a long time ago, and what was important was staying by Hibiki's side and seeing things through to the end. Afterward, they gathered around a campfire in the cool night air, the guild master already asleep in his chair while the others settled in around the warmth. Then Lillian spoke. She told Hibiki quietly that she knew how hard he was working, and that she understood his reasons, but she did not want him to leave and go back to his world, because she loved him very much. Hibiki went still, then told her gently that he was sorry, but he could not stay. Lillian told him it was all right, brushing the tears from her face with the back of her hand. She knew she was being unreasonable, she said, but she could not help how she felt. Then she stood up, produced a cup of warm liquid, and offered it to him, She had learned the recipe from Tanya, she explained, and it was supposed to help with exhaustion. Hibiki accepted it gratefully, took a long sip, and told her she had done an incredible job with it and that he already felt better. Whatever tension had been sitting between them quietly dissolved into the warmth of the fire. The next morning, as they were heading back into the forest for training, Claude suddenly stopped. He had sensed another presence nearby. Hibiki immediately opened his world map but found nothing. Before he could say a word, Claude spun around and leveled his spear at whatever was behind them. It turned out to be a young woman with blue hair, who told them calmly that she meant no harm and had simply been passing through. Hibiki was puzzled, his map had shown nothing, and yet here she was. As a precaution, he quietly appraised her. Everything read as normal. He told Claude to stand down and Claude lowered his weapon, apologizing for drawing on her. She told him not to worry about it and introduced herself as Ivy, an E-ranked adventurer who had lost her way through the forest after being chased by a large monster wolf. Hibiki immediately asked where she had last encountered it, but Ivy seemed more interested in Claude, remarking that she had never seen a beastman up close before and taking a long, unabashed look at him. She gave Lillian a similarly appraising glance, then said her farewells cheerfully, adding that she would probably see them again soon, and walked away. Once she was gone, Hibiki remarked that there was something strange about her. He opened his map to check the area and spotted a monster wolf signature deeper in the forest. They moved toward it immediately. The creature was cornered, or so it appeared. But something felt wrong. A wolf that had lived in this forest all its life would know the terrain better than any of them. Why would it have allowed itself to be boxed in? Hibiki checked his map again and felt a cold drop in his stomach. It had been a trap. They were completely surrounded by a large pack of monster wolves, every one of them closing in. Claude realized with growing dread that he had no idea whether he could handle this many at once. Before he could even settle into a fighting stance, one of the wolves slipped around behind them undetected and raked its claws across Hibiki's torso. The blow was devastating. Hibiki crumpled to the ground, blood seeping rapidly from the wound, and lost consciousness. Claude immediately threw himself into the fight, driving the wolves back and keeping them from reaching Hibiki, while Lillian worked frantically to slow the bleeding. Nothing she tried was working. What neither of them knew was that the entire ambush had been orchestrated by Ivy herself, who watched the scene unfold from her perch in the trees above, wondering quietly who had partially lifted the curse from the beastman below. Claude made a decision. He told Lillian to take Hibiki and get back to town as fast as she could, to find the guild master, who would be able to stop the bleeding and stabilize him. Lillian looked at Claude with open fear and asked when he would follow. Claude himself did not know whether he would survive what was coming, but he had no other option. He told her he would be right behind them and not to worry. Lillian chose to believe him. She summoned an earth lion with her magic, laid Hibiki across it, and rode for the forest's edge while Claude planted himself between the wolves and the path they had taken. As he watched them go, Claude noticed something: the wolves were not pursuing Hibiki and Lillian. They were focused entirely on him. He was the target. The pack closed in again and he fought them back, spear moving constantly, until the largest of the wolves stepped forward. When Claude looked into its eyes, something hit him like a physical blow. He recognized the gaze staring back at him. It was the same look as Anastasia, the elf who had nearly destroyed him. Meanwhile, Lillian rode hard toward the cave at the forest's edge as a smaller group of wolves broke away from the main pack and gave chase. She barely made it inside before they reached her, sealing the entrance behind her with earth bending. But the pack's leader was powerful enough to force tendrils through the barrier, reaching toward Hibiki's unconscious form. Lillian drove them back with a concentrated spell, buying seconds. Hibiki, drifting in and out of awareness, managed to check his own stats. He did not have much time. He tried to activate a healing spell on himself but could not summon the concentration or the physical strength to complete it. He thought about Claude, alone against an entire pack. He thought about Lillian, exhausted and terrified, fighting to protect him when she should not have had to. If he did not pull himself together, neither of them was going to make it out of this forest. Something shifted in him. He pushed through the pain, focused everything he had left, and forced the hyper-cure spell to activate. It was not a full recovery, but it was enough. He pushed himself upright and, before V could object, activated the summoned sacred beast ability. The air cracked with electricity. V was no longer small and white and quietly judgmental. She erupted into a massive lightning panther that swept the cave entrance clean with a single, devastating strike, reducing every wolf in the immediate area to nothing. Hibiki immediately asked whether V could make it back to Claude and do the same to the silver diamond wolf leading the pack. V reverted to her normal form and told him flatly that she would not be able to hold that transformation again for some time. Hibiki said it did not matter, they were not leaving Claude behind while he fought to protect them. That was not something he was willing to do. It was then that a new ability appeared in his skill list, the Medicine God Staff. Without stopping to read the full description, he activated it. Both he and Lillian were immediately restored to full health. Almost simultaneously, a plant began growing rapidly at his feet, and from one of its branches, a bow took shape. He pulled it free and appraised it, a spirit bow, a gift from the chief god. He turned it over in his hands and thought of the way Emilia used to work with her bow, channeling the wind into every shot. He raised it and tested the draw, and felt immediately that the weapon was something else entirely, responsive in a way that nothing he had held before had been. With the bow in hand and his strength returned, Hibiki set his jaw and turned toward the forest. He was going back for Claude. Whatever was out there waiting for them, they would face it together. Hibiki resolved to fight his way to Claude and ensure he was safe. Lily used her earthbending magic to summon the magical lion once more, and the group mounted it, racing toward the area where Claude was surrounded by a horde of wolves. The path was not going to be easy, however, as waves of wolves came charging at them from every direction. The only way through was to fight. Van agreed that there was no other option, so Hibiki drew his bow and charged up a spirit arrow, only to quickly realize that he struggled with archery even when his targets were stationary. Now, not only were the wolves moving, but he himself was unstable, jolting around on the lion's back. His confidence began to falter, and he doubted whether he could land a single shot under such chaotic conditions. Then he remembered a skill he had never used before, the expert eye. He activated it, and immediately his eyes turned blue as glowing hit markers appeared on each of the wolves. Moving carefully, he lined up his aim and released the arrow, watching in disbelief as it took down every wolf in his path with a single shot. He was stunned, quickly discovering that his bow never ran out of arrows, fired at blinding speed, and dealt area damage on impact. He began to quietly wonder whether what he was doing counted as a war crime, before quickly deciding not to dwell on it. Lily, meanwhile, conjured a wind blade and sent it slicing through another cluster of wolves. A few stragglers remained on their right flank, so she used her earthbending to raise a tangle of vines from the ground, binding the remaining wolves in place and cutting off their pursuit. For the moment, the path was clear. Hibiki marveled aloud at how the wolves had managed to coordinate a pincer attack. Vene explained that the wolves were not acting intelligently on their own, they were being directed by someone far smarter. She told the group that their immediate priority had to be defeating the silver diamond wolf, as doing so would likely end the threat posed by the rest of the pack. Hibiki wondered how such a powerful creature had ended up in the forest in the first place. Vene admitted she had a gut feeling that it was connected to Ivy, the girl they had met earlier, suspecting that if Ivy had not told them about the forest, they never would have ventured so deep into it. Hibiki was skeptical, but Vene was quietly certain, and she noted that something about Ivy's face nagged at her memory, as though she had seen it somewhere before. Back at the main battlefield, Claude was battered and nearly spent. He had managed to cut down almost the entire wolf pack, but had taken heavy damage in the process and was teetering on the edge of collapse. The fight was not over yet, though. The silver diamond wolf, the pack's leader, still lived, and it began advancing slowly toward him. Claude dropped to one knee, his thoughts drifting to Anastasia, the woman he had once loved, who had ultimately destroyed everything he held dear. He tried to reach out to her through the wolf, but quickly accepted it was useless, and steeled himself for one final, desperate clash. The diamond wolf lunged. Claude raised his spear, but the wolf was too fast, striking him hard on the side. Blood spilled from his mouth as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The wolf's ears perked up sharply, sensing something incoming, and it raised its barrier just in time to deflect the attack as Hibiki and the others came thundering toward it. Hibiki was stunned that his arrow had been blocked. Van explained that the diamond wolf was protected by an exceptionally powerful defensive barrier, one that Hibiki's current power level was simply not strong enough to penetrate. The wolf turned its attention back to the fallen Claude, intent on finishing him off. Hibiki shouted and fired arrow after arrow in a desperate attempt to draw its focus, but none of it had any effect. Just when hope seemed to slip away entirely, the pact between Hibiki and Claude activated, pulling Claude away from danger and placing him near Hibiki atop the earthen lion, which promptly crumbled, leaving Claude bleeding on the ground below. Hibiki rushed to check on him, but Van screamed at Lily to deal with the wolf, which was barreling toward them with ferocious hunger in its eyes. Lily unleashed her full magical power, raising a barrier of swirling wind around the group. The wolf was pushed back, but it retaliated by ripping boulders from the earth and hurling them at the tornado, trying to break through. Vene urged the group to stabilize Claude and retreat immediately, arguing it was their only real chance of survival. With the diagnosis complete, Hibiki cast his Hypercure spell on Claude and checked the wolf's status, discovering to his alarm that the creature was being controlled by Anastasia, the very woman Claude had loved, the same one who had appeared in his dreams. He attempted to follow up with his perfect heal spell, but found he lacked the mana to cast it. Lily was burning through her mana maintaining the wind barrier, leaving little to share with him. He tried the most powerful healing spell available within his current reserves, but even that fell short. Then the barrier gave out. One of the boulders punched through and whizzed narrowly past their heads. Lily collapsed to the ground, unconscious from sheer exhaustion, leaving Hibiki alone to face the massive wolf. From the trees, Ivy watched and laughed, remarking to herself that Hibiki could have simply fled when he had the chance, but instead had chosen to throw his life away for someone else's sake. Hibiki planted his feet, charged his arrow to its absolute limit, and released it as the wolf charged. The arrow struck the barrier and bounced harmlessly away. He stared at the result, wondering if this was truly the end. Then Claude's fist slammed into the wolf, stopping it cold. Hibiki stared, barely able to believe what he was seeing. Claude struggled to his feet, and in that moment something shifted within him, the cap on his power shattered, and his level skyrocketed from the low 20s all the way into the high 90s. With that surge of restored strength, he drove the wolf into the wall, then turned and thanked Hibiki for healing him, telling him to step aside and leave the rest to him. Claude summoned a new spear, overflowing with magical energy. He launched himself skyward in a golden blur, transforming the spear into a homing projectile, declaring that it would find its target no matter what barriers stood in the way. The wolf scrambled to raise its defensive barrier, but Claude called out that it was useless. For his spear, the barrier was no more than a sheet of paper. He released it. The spear tore through the barrier as though it wasn't there and obliterated the wolf completely. The monster's head landed at Hibiki's feet. Using his appraisal skill, he discovered that even Anastasia herself had been under someone else's control. A moment later, her ghostly form materialized beside him, and she thanked him quietly for freeing her from her life of cruelty and destruction. She said she could finally rest in peace, and then she was gone. Claude turned to Hibiki and apologized, insisting that everything that had happened was his fault. Hibiki asked whether Claude's hero powers had been restored, but learned that the surge had been temporary. Claude explained that Anastasia had possessed the power to control other living beings, but someone had eventually seized control of her in turn, forcing her to betray everything she had once stood for. When Hibiki asked whether breaking Anastasia's control might lift Claude's curse, Claude replied that she had already died, killed, in a tragic twist, by his own hands, and that he had simply never anticipated that creatures under her influence might still be active. He blamed himself for the oversight. Hibiki told him plainly that none of it was his fault. Claude was a victim, and there was no reason to treat him otherwise. Before he could say anything more, the adrenaline drained from Hibiki's body all at once. The toll of casting such high-level spells caught up with him instantly, and he collapsed. He woke 2 full days later, on a bright morning, alongside Claude and Lily. He had had no idea he had slept so long, and the experience left his body feeling frail and depleted, a reminder that powerful magic extracted a serious physical cost. He also quickly discovered that 2 days of unconsciousness made for a very sharp hunger. The group made their way downstairs to find that Tanya had prepared a generous feast, and they ate until they could eat no more. That evening, returning to their rooms, Hibiki felt a quiet and unexpected contentment wash over him as he looked around at his companions. He told them that he had been rethinking the plan to travel to Terodina's via the dungeon in order to find the sages. His family and friends were waiting for him back in his world, and one day he would find his way home, but for now, he said, he was genuinely happy with the life he had here. He promised that he would find a solution that allowed him to return without leaving Claude and Lily behind. Lily was overjoyed and said she would love to come with him. Claude was uncertain, and Vene was skeptical, pointing out that it probably was not as simple as Hibiki was making it sound. But Hibiki remained optimistic, believing that things would fall into place one step at a time. Claude conceded that even though the road ahead would not be easy, Hibiki just might find a way to pull it off. He knelt before him once more and pledged his allegiance, swearing to follow Hibiki to the ends of the earth if necessary. Lily echoed the vow. Even Vene finally let her guard down and admitted that she had been having a great deal of fun, and that she wanted to stay with them. Later that same day, Hibiki stood at the window, lost in thought, when Lily came to ask him about his family and friends back home. Claude leaned in, equally curious. Hibiki told them both that he used to spend long, easy hours with his closest friends over cups of black tea, and that one of his friends' families even ran a tea cafe. The term black tea was entirely unfamiliar to Lily, and Hibiki's added context did not exactly clear things up for her. Claude remarked that just as Hibiki missed the people in his old world, those people were surely missing him too. Hibiki agreed, but said that the distance did not make him sad because he had found equally wonderful friends in this world as well. The following day, the group visited the guild, where Guild Master Bal heard the full account of the battle with the Silver Diamond Wolf and was visibly impressed. He told Hibiki that defeating an enemy of that caliber required more than raw talent. Hibiki was touched, but Bal quickly pivoted to blaming himself for Hibiki's collapse during the fight, and immediately declared that the solution was to take him to the gym without delay. Guild Master Jewel had little patience for that plan. She froze Bal's head and calmly told Hibiki the real reason they had called him in, to discuss the reward for defeating the Silver Diamond Wolf. The number left Hibiki speechless. Jewel explained that had the creature reached the town, the casualties would have been devastating, and even Bal would have struggled against it. Bal, now free from the ice, told Hibiki not to be modest and to take what he had earned. He did. Next, the group headed to Dobby's shop. The eccentric merchant greeted Hibiki in his usual unsettling fashion, sniffing the air around him and noting that he had grown considerably wealthier since their last visit. He greeted Lily and Claude warmly enough before ushering everyone inside. Despite Hibiki's slight hesitation about bringing friends into the shop given its peculiar history, Dobby assured him that wealth was the only credential that mattered there. In the weapons showroom, Hibiki selected a windlayer tunic designed to help him evade attacks. When Dobby asked what weapons he wanted to pair with it, Hibiki said he was satisfied with his current bow, which he doubted anything could surpass. Lily, meanwhile, chose a robe and a blossom wand, and Hibiki told her the combination suited her perfectly. Dobby announced that the total bill came to 1,200 gold coins. Hibiki and Lily both went pale at the figure, but Claude accepted it cheerfully, noting that any other shop would have charged them 1,500 coins, and Dobby proudly agreed that his prices were the most competitive in the business. Claude then selected a crop-top style armor for himself. Hibiki suggested something with a bit more coverage, but Dobby explained that the piece came with an enchantment that functioned as a full suit of plate armor in practice. Hibiki confirmed this with his appraisal skill, then checked Claude's next selection, a magnetic spear with multiple combat applications, and verified that as well. Dobby grew curious and asked what level Hibiki's appraisal skill was at. When Hibiki replied that it was level 5, Dobby nearly danced with excitement. He explained that most appraisers spent their entire careers stuck at level 1 or 2, and that even his own veteran appraiser had only ever reached level 3. Hibiki had not fully grasped until that moment just how exceptional his skill was, and he muttered quietly that he wished the chief god would give him these kinds of heads up in advance. The god simply said oops and told him to go ahead and use the other ability he had been holding back. Before Hibiki could process any of that, Dobby asked when he planned to depart and offered to prepare a carriage and all necessary supplies. Relieved that he did not have to draft a shopping list himself, Hibiki told Dobby to handle the essentials. Outside shortly after, Hibiki decided to test his new ability, Relief Measure, on Claude. Using the skill, he could see that Claude was bound by invisible chains. The moment he activated it against them, the system announced that a holy beast would be summoned, and before Hibiki could fully register what that meant, a small rabbit with a gemstone embedded in its forehead appeared before them, introducing itself as Ka, a holy beast in service of the chief god. Hibiki did not hear most of the introduction. He immediately lunged toward the rabbit to cuddle it, and Lily scrambled to join him. Ka bristled at what it considered a flagrant lack of respect for its divine status, though privately, it was not entirely opposed to being cuddled. Claude, however, took one look at the rabbit and completely lost composure, his primal instinct surging to the surface as he began roaring and snarling. The outburst startled everyone. Hibiki suspected it might be some effect of the holy beast's power, but Vene had seen enough. She smacked everyone into order, then fixed Ka with a sharp glare and told it to do its job before engaging in any further nonsense. Ka, somewhat chastened, decided to show her what it was capable of when it was being serious. It activated its domain expansion, conjuring 2 massive hands of light that reached out and seized Claude's invisible chains. Focusing the power of its gemstone, Ka pulled with increasing force until the chains shattered completely. Hibiki was elated. Claude expressed his gratitude, and Hibiki pointed out that the thanks rightly belonged to Ka. Claude obliged, though he was still growling. Vene noted with quiet pride that he had come a long way, given that he was merely growling rather than giving chase. Sensing that remaining was unwise, Ka wasted no time and promptly hopped back to the divine realm. The next day brought a record-breaking heat wave. Being a wolf by nature, Claude had significant trouble regulating his body temperature. Even with Lily doing her best with cold wet towels, 39 degrees Celsius proved extremely uncomfortable. Hibiki suggested, rather casually, that Claude might consider trimming his fur to help cool down. Claude looked horrified at the idea, but because it was Hibiki who had suggested it, he reluctantly agreed. Hibiki handed a pair of scissors to Lily, who began approaching Claude's fur with an experimental gleam in her eye. Fortunately, Vene arrived before any damage could be done, offering a far better solution. She instructed Lily to form balls of water using her magic and then cast a secondary spell to hold them permanently in shape, turning them into giant cooling pillows. The effect was immediate and welcome. Their relief was interrupted when Tanya burst into the room, dressed for the heat and clearly miserable in it, declaring that she felt she might die. Hibiki promptly hit her with a bubble wash. A short while later, Hibiki decided to head outside in search of a more lasting solution to the heat. Lily volunteered to join him, and Claude tried to follow, but discovered he could not bear to step away from the cooling bubbles for even a moment. Hibiki told him to stay and rest, and asked Lily to help manage things there. Vene agreed to accompany Hibiki instead. The streets outside were completely deserted, with no one willing to venture into the midday sun. As they made their way through the empty town, Hibiki spotted Dobby approaching with his secretary. The merchant greeted him in his usual manner, reassured him that his carriage would be ready in a couple more days, and was surprised when Hibiki told him he hadn't come for the carriage. Instead, Hibiki asked Dobby something that had caught his attention. How was he standing outside in such heat without so much as breaking a sweat? Dobby explained proudly that his suit was specially crafted to regulate body temperature in any climate. Hibiki immediately asked if one could be made for him. Dobby regretted that his company's stock of raw materials was temporarily depleted. Hibiki headed directly to the guild to consult Jewel, who knew exactly what he needed: the Cloak of Everlasting Spring, an enchanted garment that maintained comfortable body temperature regardless of weather conditions. Hibiki told her that Dobby had mentioned a magical flower called Ayu was required to produce new cloaks, and he wanted to know where to find them. Jewel consulted a reference book and informed him that the flowers grew deep within the eastern forest, though she warned him that the forest had no established roads, making navigation extremely difficult. That said, she knew the route well and decided to accompany him this time. As they entered the forest, Vene fell asleep almost immediately. Hibiki stared at her for a moment and wondered aloud why she had even bothered coming. Jewel remarked that he was doing all of this for Claude and Lily's sake, and Hibiki replied that he simply wanted to repay them for how much they had given in his name. He continued talking about how remarkable and selfless his companions were, rambling on without quite realizing it, until, by the time he paused for breath, they had already arrived at their destination. That evening, Hibiki returned home to find Claude and Lily in much better spirits. They had a surprise waiting for him as well, a box of waffles. Claude explained that he and Lily had wanted to thank him for caring so much about them, so they had gone out and tracked down some black tea and snacks to go along with it. As Hibiki settled in to enjoy his tea, it struck him that his friends had gone out of their way specifically because he had mentioned black tea in passing a few days earlier. It also occurred to him that it had been a while since he had checked their status. He used his skill on them both and was stunned to discover that Lily had advanced to the rank of sage. Everyone erupted with excitement at the news, though Lily herself said she didn't feel any different. Vene told her to give it time. Hibiki then added that his own grimoire skill had also leveled up, and Vene immediately told him to activate it and refresh her knowledge base. He did, and she declared herself ready to teach him some new magic. A few days later, the morning of departure finally arrived. Hibiki's friends gathered to see him off. Before leaving, he presented Claude with the cloak of everlasting spring. The wolf was deeply moved and swore to treasure it for the rest of his life. Then Hibiki gave Lily her cloak as well. Just as the farewell was wrapping up, Bal showed up and tasked Claude with overseeing Hibiki's physical training and making sure he came back with considerably more muscle. Claude flatly refused, saying that his purpose was to protect Hibiki, not supervise his gym schedule. The two squared off, looking very much like they were about to come to blows, until Jewel froze both of their heads. Turning to Lily, she calmly reminded her to stay alert, as the northern dungeon was far more dangerous than anything they had faced in the forest. With that, Hibiki and his companions rode off toward the dungeon, unaware that his friends from his original world had actually crossed over as well and were currently working as zombie hunters while searching for him. This is where the video ends. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.